For the past 6 months, Disney archivists have been carefully selecting the props, costumes, artwork, and artifacts that will populate D23 Presents Treasures of the Walt Disney Archives at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library and Museum. This 12,000 square foot exhibit is the largest ever assembled by the Walt Disney Archives, featuring more than 500 iconic pieces, most of which have rarely or never been seen by the general public. It took some creative thinking in order to get some of the pieces to the exhibit. How often do you see the head of Maleficent in dragon form from Disneyland's Fantasmic driving down the freeway? A fleet of trucks from UPS, Movers of the Magic, helped to transport this stunning collection, including the massive model of the Black Pearl from the Pirates of the Caribbean movies. And the Reagan Library even expanded its exhibition space to accommodate these treasures. Disney archivists also have been preparing other pieces, like the Model T from The Absent-Minded Professor, and a full recreation of Walt Disney's formal office, which will be on display for the first time outside of Disneyland. A few Disney Parks attraction vehicles are also in the mix, including original Peter Pan's Flight and Mr. Toad's Wild Ride vehicles. Treasures of the Walt Disney Archives, presented by D23, the official Disney fan club, runs through April 2013 at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library.
Ronald Reagan was a man who said what he meant and meant what he said. It was leadership, pure and simple.
In good times and bad, Ronald Reagan embodied optimism. This is so true that I don't even have to tell you his favorite joke. I only have to repeat the punchline. There must be a pony in here somewhere.
When he saw evil camped across the horizon, he called that evil by its name.
Talking about the Cold War, and he said it's not complicated. The way I look at it, we win, they lose.
I was asked later, do you trust Putin? I didn't want to plagiarize President Reagan. I gave one of the great responses, trust but verify, and I wasn't quick enough to think of anything clever that didn't sound like plagiarism. So I said, yeah.
I will always see President Reagan as the last great gentleman of American politics.
The contributions that he made to this country were tremendous, but the contributions he made to the world were even greater.
Ronald Reagan understood that wealth came from the hard work and the intelligence and the creativity of free minds and free people and free markets. And Ronald Reagan trusted ordinary people to make better decisions in their lives than to rely upon Washington bureaucrats, and we should too.
Just when the Reagan Revolution was declared over, millions are being inspired to repeat it, to insist on it. And woe to the leaders in Washington today if they fail to respect it.
I love what Ronald Reagan said. I have to read these to make sure I get the quote quite right. He said, governments don't reduce deficits by raising taxes on people. Government reduces deficits by controlling spending and stimulating new wealth. That's what America's all about.
He was not a great president because he was afraid of his principles. He was a great president because he had principles, and he never wavered from governing with them.
Ronald Reagan knew that in this country the issue was not right versus left, it was right versus wrong, and standing up for freedom is always right every time.
There's only Ronald Reagan could do. He shook his head and said, "And they call me an actor."
He was a magnificent leader. And anytime I get a chance to speak about his record, I'm proud to do so. And when somebody says, Mr. President, I don't have to ask what president you're talking about. There's only one Mr. President as far as I'm concerned.
History is going to be very kind to Ronald Reagan. When he was our president, ladies and gentlemen, we were indeed a shining city on a hill.
It is a great honor. I don't do a lot of these events. And I want to thank the people at the Reagan Library. You know, this isn't just a library. I consider this like a national town hall meeting place for people who remember the Reagan Revolution and think we need another. So, thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The program is about to begin. At this time, we ask that you turn off all cellular devices. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Jon Huntsman, and I have the honor of being the Executive Director of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation. Welcome to all of you this evening. In honor of our men and women in uniform who protect our freedom around the world, if you please stand and join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Please be seated. Before we get started, I'd like to take just a moment to recognize some special guests we have with us this evening. And I'll begin, of course, with Governor Huntsman's wife, Mary Kay, and 3 of his children, Elizabeth, Asha, and Gracie. Thank you all so much for coming. From our Board of Trustees, Andrew Littlefair. Andrew, thank you for coming. California State Assemblyman Scott Wilk and his wife Vanessa. Scott. Simi Valley Mayor Pro Tem Mike Judge. Thousand Oaks Council Member Jackie Irwin. Almost there. Dean of the Pepperdine University School of Public Policy, Jim Wilburn. Jim, thank you for coming. And last but not least, the Director of the Reagan Library, Duke Blackwood. Duke. Okay, so I am going to be uncharacteristically brief in introducing our guest speaker this evening because while his lifetime of public service deserves an eloquent introduction and a warm welcome, I promise you will get a lot more out of listening to his words today than you will by having me simply stand here and recite his accomplishments. But so in keeping it brief, I'd want to focus on just a few things, and then like you, I'll take my seat and welcome him home. And I say welcome him home because he is right here at home in the house that Ronald Reagan built. One of his very first jobs out of college was as a staff assistant to President Reagan in the White House. I think it's safe to say that throughout his public service career, whether as an ambassador to Singapore or China, as Deputy U.S. Trade Representative, as the Governor of Utah, of course, and as the newest member of the Reagan Foundation Board of Trustees, we are proud to say, Jon Huntsman has embodied a pragmatic sense of conservatism very much like our 40th President, Ronald Reagan. First and foremost, there is a likeness in the two men in that while they've shared much in the way of philosophy, they've also had in common throughout their careers an important thing. It's a burning desire to simply solve problems. Both conservatively principled, to be sure, as they tackle tough issues. But if there is one quality that rings forth from any legitimate biography of Jon Huntsman, it is that throughout his career, again, like Ronald Reagan, he has consistently placed love of country above politics. Now, don't get me wrong, I know he has a love for politics. He's one of the most successful leaders and politicians in the Republican Party in this young century. But I believe he's been successful because, like Ronald Reagan, he figured out something very important long ago. and that is placing love of country above politics is smart politics. And I have no doubt he very likely feels there's a lesson in that for the Republican Party today. I've heard him say that it's time for the Republican Party to consider this notion and get back into the business of leading again. We might hear something more about that from him tonight. Governor Huntsman also knows something about accomplishment. Like President Reagan, he was a two-term governor of a western state who cut taxes, reformed his state's tax code, and cut government waste. When he was governor of Utah, he was graded as running the best managed state in the country. I don't recall what President Reagan's approval rating was right after he left office when he was governor of California, but Jon Huntsman's service in Utah ended only a few short years ago, and he left office with an approval rating of over 80%. Now, I have no doubt that Jon Huntsman's voice, his experience, and frankly, his courage are going to be critical in shaping the future of the Republican Party and our country for years to come. We are honored to have him with us here today. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a warm welcome to the Reagan Library, Governor Jon Huntsman.
For that very gracious and, I might add, completely undeserved introduction. I do feel at home. In fact, walking in this building is all by itself a rather spiritual experience for me. And looking at the cars and the planes and the wall hangings, it brings back a certain sense of goodness that I felt while working for President Reagan. Thank you, John, for all of the work that you do for keeping this center alive and well, which probably represents the most important center of economic and political thinking and leadership that exists anywhere in the world today. And to Andrew Littlefair, my good friend, who I think may have taken my place in the White House and did a much better job as advance man than I could ever dreamed of doing. It's a pleasure to be with you, my friend. And to my family who are here, my wife, Mary Kay, who's the finest human being I think I've ever known. And we're going on 30 years of marriage. She's a remarkable human being. I left my employment with President Reagan to begin our journey together, and we've never looked back. And I'm honored and delighted to be here with my daughter Liddy, who was a blogger during the presidential campaign. I can't say she won us enough votes to get to the finish line, but we won't get into that part. But she was very effective and beloved by her generation. Our daughter Gracie. Gracie, stand up for a moment. Gracie was my senior foreign policy advisor. And people thought I was joking when I used to announce her as such in some of the early primary states, but sure enough, she was there with us much of that journey, as was Asha. And I'm honored to be with one and all. John forgot to mention that the most important part of my biography is this: I'm just a failed rock and roll musician. So what is a natural fallback for a failed rock and roll musician? Politics. So you'll have to put in perspective whatever it is I leave behind with you today. And you know you're getting old when a plane you once flew in is hanging in a museum. So sorry, girls, so much for Dad pretending to be young and hip. They're never going to believe that story any longer. Like some of my friends who are here today, one of my first jobs in politics was working for President Reagan. And as I reflect back on that time in my life, the overwhelming feeling I recall are those of excitement and pride. But as I look up at this plane, I quite specifically remember the reason I was so proud. As they say, politics ain't beanbag. It's a tough sport played by a lot of ruthless people. But President Reagan was gentle and kind. He was a person of decency, civility, and fairness, with core beliefs that were consistent with our nation's highest aspirations: freedom. I was proud because the America I came of age in was a country struggling with a stagnant economy, rampant political dysfunction at home, and great power challenges abroad. Sound familiar? And in one election, things changed. I was living 10,000 miles away. In 1980, I was living over in Asia. And still 10,000 miles away, I felt the shockwaves from that election. A single election transformed a party and lifted the nation's collective spirits. It's called leadership, and we haven't seen it in a very long time. And it is, ladies and gentlemen, the most enduring legacy of the man who this building celebrates. Now, having just passed another birthday, I can now say with increasing confidence that one of the few benefits of age is perspective. So let me share just a few things with you. When I grew up, half the world's population was locked off behind the Iron Curtain, condemned to poverty. Today, goat herders in Kenya have smartphones to check smart prices. Hundreds of millions of people in Asia are lifting themselves out of poverty. And the entire world market is buying our goods, our ideas, produced by American workers, scientists, and entrepreneurs. I was born in 1960. We exported $3 for every $2 we imported. We ran a big trade surplus. We owned 36% of the world's GDP, 25% of which was derived from basic manufacturing. Healthcare as a percentage of that GDP was 2% as opposed to 18 or 19% today. Challenges? No question about it. Opportunities? You got it. When I was born in 1960, a call to India cost $12 per minute. Today, it's practically free if you know how to do it. Right? 0.1 cents. And I can't even begin to tell you how much commerce is transacted through that form of communication around the world. The cost of sequencing a gene, 1974. I watch this because in my part-time I get to chair the Huntsman Cancer Institute, and I see the work of the scientific community and the breakthroughs that are occurring in conquering human disease and extending human life, and it's extraordinary. But the cost of sequencing a gene in 1974 was $150 million, a single gene. Today, 0.01 cents. And I needn't tell you the implications there. They're rather profound for basic science in extending human life beyond anywhere near what anyone could predict today. 1960. The cost for computer storage, $2 million per megabyte. Remember those days? $2 million per megabyte. And then along came the IBM 370 in 1976, the year that music was really bad. And it went from $2 million a megabyte to about $1 million a megabyte. And today my daughter Grace can walk in an Apple store and buy an iPod, $249, 160 gigabytes, not megabytes. The equivalent today, 1 megabyte, 0.0016 pennies. Ladies and gentlemen, are we moving forward with lightning speed in terms of our capability? There is no question about it. We have a pretty good hand to play, I would argue. The question is, will we play it correctly? Will we maximize our advantages, which are significant as a people and as a country, and begin to solve our most pressing problems? Or will we continue to be diminished by dysfunction? President Reagan looked at our problems and he solved them. He dramatically lowered and then reformed our tax code. Even as he confronted the Soviet Union in some of the darkest days of the Cold War, he dreamed of a world without nuclear weapons. I heard it on a couple of occasions, being around him as an advance man. As a party, we seem to have forgotten President Reagan's reliance on basic principles and problem solving, and have spent way too much time on tactics and spin and decisions made for the next election cycle and not the next generation, and too often putting party before our country. Now, times have changed, and we must update President Reagan's vision. Yet any new vision will still be consistent with the first principles that the president held of limited government, individual responsibility and opportunity, and private community volunteer efforts to reach local problems that no government could ever cure. These principles are not abstract constructs of political theory. They derive from our understanding of human nature, defined by thinkers like Adam Smith, who decried big government lest it be corrupted and captured by special interests, who wanted protection from corruption. Now, if Smith were alive today, he would say that we need to abandon big government and get back to old-fashioned competition, which, however imperfect it might be, is most compatible with the human condition. The pride that I felt, that of being even a low-level advance man, was that of being part of a team that was accomplishing the people's work, confronting and solving big problems that allowed the American people to forge a national renewal and close the trust deficit between the country and our political leadership. Now, that is not an imagined past, ladies and gentlemen. That is what President Reagan and the Republican Party did. Somewhere along the line, the Republican Party moved away from that legacy. Beating the other guy and winning elections became ends in and of themselves, not a means to an end. Americans by nature are blue sky, problem-solving optimists, the best in the world. When a party stops solving problems, the American people move away from it. And a great truth with a capital T that everybody in this room knows is the case is that we are better than where our party is today. We need to get back to problem solving. Around the world, other nations are making the tough choices necessary to compete in the 21st century. I've seen this firsthand. I have lived in their countries. My kids have attended their schools. America must get serious about solutions, and today we are not. So as an eternal optimist, and with all due humility, I'd like to share just a few thoughts about what a pathway forward might actually look like. So number one, ultimately our most urgent problem is one of anemic growth and decreased competitiveness. You know, I learned as governor that growth and uplift in economic prospects provides political latitude to put our social welfare programs on a sustainable path and to subsidize our exploding debt before markets lose faith in our government's ability to do so. And just as critically, growth gives us the strength we need to confront our challenges abroad. And let me remind you, as a practitioner who has lived 4 times overseas, it is absolutely impossible to preach economic reform abroad when our own house is a mess. We need to once again make the United States the world's most competitive economic nation In some cases, we need to roll back the federal government. In some cases, we need to retool it. But let us be abundantly clear. Not making a choice to do so is, in fact, a choice. To equivocate and to fight about placing blame without trying to deliver solutions is to accept decline and hand off to our children a diminished inheritance. We must recognize that developing and attracting human capital is critical to our nation's economic success, but it's also a moral imperative. Our journey as a people has always been one towards ever-increasing equality of opportunity. That means making sure every child is given a chance to fulfill their God-given potential. There is no better place to start reaching for this goal than through reform of our education system. Our public education system, and we love our teachers, was designed to serve a 19th century economy that no longer exists. It needs to be modernized for the 21st century, and the Republican Party has a huge opportunity to build off of work done in places like Utah, and by Governor Bush in Florida, and Governor Daniels in Indiana, to improve educational outcomes. The plans and the tools are there. The examples of success can be found, but we've been too slow in recognizing that education is ultimately central to our national security. This isn't just an economic issue or a competitive issue, but a moral issue as well. Improved education and family choice are among the most important civil rights issues of the new century. We need to end our one-size-fits-all approach and create a new focus on individual students. Our path should consist of two overarching goals. One, introducing market forces into the education system. And two, maximizing transparency so state and local leaders can identify problems and achieve better outcomes. Good, old-fashioned accountability. Now, as I mentioned, my grandfather Huntsman was a public school teacher, taught music in rural Idaho. He ended his career as principal of Los Altos High School. In his worldview, you couldn't achieve a higher rung in life than that of being an educator. Everything else was far below. And if he were with us today, he would say, we must encourage our best and brightest to pursue education as a career choice. By any measure, America has the best system of higher education in the world. And it's worth noting the contrast between that competitive open marketplace of success and the seeming collapse of the public monopoly that is our K-12 system. Our higher education system is one of the commanding heights of the global economy, and it must be protected. Number two, maximizing our human capital isn't just about developing what is already here. It's about maximizing our share of global talent. A quarter of all American high technology firms founded in recent years have at least one immigrant founder. And 42% of the individuals who earn doctorates in science and engineering from our universities were born overseas. Given these achievements, imagine the opportunity costs of the 1907 Gentlemen's Agreement, which restricted Japanese immigration, the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, and the 1924 Immigration Act, which effectively ended mass Eastern and Southern European immigration. Those laws deprive the United States of millions of talented and driven citizens. Today we're educating people and then kicking them out of the country to build their futures elsewhere. Let's stop making the mistakes of the past. Republicans should focus on immigration as a key economic driver rather than solely as a security issue, and begin to govern accordingly. Beyond the human dimension, we also need to level the playing field they compete on, which takes me to number three. We can start with tax reform. For example, I'd like to see tax reform where subsidies and preferences are completely eliminated, as they were in President Reagan's second term, as I was able to introduce in the state of Utah. They do nothing but distort the marketplace. Real tax reform would help the economy allocate resources more effectively by removing subsidies to non-productive sectors, which might even have slowed the housing bubble when you stop to think about it. Tax reform can reduce transaction costs, which are a tax on all economic activity, and it would help bridge the growing trust deficit by killing loopholes for the wealthy, such as carried interest. I'd like to see tax reform so that well-entrenched incumbent firms don't have undue advantages based on long-term access to decision makers and bureaucrats in Washington. Tax reform, when you stop to think about it, could be the single most powerful weapon in cleaning up crony capitalism in Washington, D.C. Number 4, and this is the game changer, ladies and gentlemen. Energy reform has the potential to eliminate our dependence on foreign energy sources and make us the biggest producer of energy, fossil and alternative, in the world. Let me repeat that. Energy reform has the potential to eliminate our dependence on foreign energy sources. I never thought I'd hear that stated during my lifetime, and here we are. Today we spend over $300 billion a year on imported oil. Just imagine the impact on the American economy if that money was spent at home, employing American workers, being deployed in our community banks, and being invested here. Already, American railroads are looking at converting their fleet from oil to natural gas. This is a big deal. The sea change is already happening, and we do require government to clearly define the rules of the road. That's going to happen eventually, you hope. Energy self-sufficiency is within our grasp and will be our nation's most powerful engine of growth in the coming years. Let's not bungle it up. Number 5, regulatory reform isn't limited to the energy sector only. Financial regulatory reform is also critically important. The capital markets, when you stop to think about it, are the circulatory system of the American economy. I would like to see a world where we're not all held hostage to banks that are too big to fail, and thus are regulated as public utilities, where the state picks winners and losers, keeping capital out of the hands of entrepreneurs, as well as providing comfortable sinecures for our mandarins between their stints in Washington. President Eisenhower, a Republican, created our national highway system. There is a role for federal capital investment, such as modernizing the national power grid and supporting non-commercial research at the Department of Energy in order to pursue basic research not found or funded by the private sector. During a State of the Union, President Obama proposed mapping the human brain. Republicans should be first in line providing funding for such a program. Number 6, the root of the word conservative is to conserve. Environmental protection should be a conservative value, as it once was. Recall, we are the party of Theodore Roosevelt, who understood this thing called humanity, which is passed from generation to generation. It's also tied to the air we breathe and the land that we share. Number 7, Republicans must also begin to recognize the effect that the Iraq War has had on the party's hard-earned reputation for competence and sobriety in the conduct of foreign affairs. Where we used to end wars, Eisenhower in Korea, Nixon in Vietnam, we are now too often the party that cheerleads them. When I was appointed ambassador to China, I spent some time reading about the history of the position. The first American envoy to China, a man by the name of Caleb Cushing, who was dispatched there in 1844 by President John Tyler, our 10th President of the United States, to negotiate what would become the Treaty of Wangsha, pattern very similar to the Treaty of Nanjing, which had been negotiated a couple of years earlier by the British, the purpose of which was to open the Chinese market for American commerce. 1844. We need to get back to such a policy. One driven by advancing our economic interests. This means aggressively pursuing trade liberalization on a bilateral basis if necessary, but at the same time enforcing our intellectual property rights and aggressively pushing back at those who abuse our goodwill, making sure the global playing field is on an even keel for American workers. Consistent with this goal, America should always stand for the freedom of others, as this ultimately means security right here at home. Working towards freedom for others does not necessarily mean seeking out monsters to destroy, but standing with those who seek their own liberty around the world. From Cuba off of our own coast to a woman under house arrest in the outskirts of Beijing. And as we stand for liberty abroad, we must not lose sight of freedom here at home. Congress needs to work with the executive branch to figure out how to oversee the new garrison state right here in America, which has given rise to a scale of surveillance at home and perpetual intervention abroad that is new in our experience as a nation. I would like to see our foreign and military strategy and budgets set on the basis of our long-term threats and vulnerabilities, not on the basis of procurement patterns developed 2 decades ago and reinforced today by armies of lobbyists, political consultants, and campaign bundlers. Today, we are cannibalizing the resources that we need for a Pacific century by building overpriced planes that don't work and tanks which are not needed, whose constituency isn't our military, but Congress. Now, I don't believe that there is any real disagreement, maybe around the edges, among almost all Americans as it relates to some of the goals that I've just laid out. So why are they so hard to achieve? Let's get right down to the bottom line. First, many Americans aren't willing to give us, Republicans, a fair hearing. It's difficult to get people to consider your reform ideas if they think, sometimes with good reason, you don't like or respect them. Building a winning coalition to tackle the looming fiscal and trust deficit will be impossible if we continue to alienate broad segments of the population. We must be happy warriors who refuse to tolerate those who want Hispanic votes, but not Hispanic neighbors. We should applaud states that lead on reforming drug policy. And consistent with the Republican Party's origins, we must demand equality under the law for all Americans, including marriage. Second, I believe there are structural problems with our political institutions that incentivize crony capitalism and big government, so that the best connected can perpetuate their government preferences, whether they be outdated weapon systems or subsidies for big bank bailouts. To me, the heart of the problem is the revolving door, where the overseers and the overseen tend to morph into each other. Wall Street and the government become almost interchangeable. Weapons producers and the Pentagon become lookalikes. The tax writing committees of Congress start to resemble the Gucci Gulch of K Street in Washington, D.C. And then we have the problem caused directly and indirectly by our current campaign finance practices, which are a threat, I do believe, to the health of our democracy. Let me give you 2 numbers to illustrate the growing dimensions of this crisis. Ronald Reagan, 9, Barack Obama, 222. Now, these numbers actually reflect a win for President Reagan. They represent the number of campaign fundraisers, the events, fundraising events, each president attended during their re-election year. Imagine trying to meet the demands of the office of the presidency while doing fundraisers on what averages out to be 2 out of every 3 days of the 4th year of the presidency. 2 out of every 3 days of the 4th year of the presidency. And the problem is, if anything, worse in Congress, where many members spend hours every day in phone booths maintained by the party committees, dialing for dollars, and their leadership PACs, their party committees. And that, my friends, is while Congress is in session. On breaks, the leadership of both houses disperse to resorts and major financial centers around the country to feed the ever-growing appetite of our political system for dollars. There are 3 major problems with what I have just described. First, our elected leaders are simply spending too much time fundraising during their terms of office, time that they should be spending working on public policy to strengthen our country. The amount of time spent by our entire elected federal leadership desperately searching for money, rather than doing the nation's business, constitutes a domestic threat to our national security. Second, office holders are inevitably going to feel grateful to those who contribute to them, rather than towards policies that an unbiased view might conclude would be better for the country, or policies favored by average citizens. And that leads to the third problem with our current campaign finance policies. Those who participate and garner the so-called insider status are a tiny percentage of a tiny percentage of the country. Some talk of the 1%ers. Well, I was stunned to learn that only 1/3 of 1% of all Americans contribute the minimum $200 in the aggregate to any federal candidate or committee in a 2-year election cycle to be recognized on the FEC list of campaign contributions. So that means that 99 2/3% of Americans do not even participate at the lowest recognized level of our campaign finance system. So with numbers like this, my friends, it is no wonder that vast majorities of the public and of both parties pronounce themselves disaffected with government and consider that it represents the special interests and not the rest of the American people. As Americans, we cannot be comfortable with this status quo. And as a Republican, I believe in the importance of an engaged citizenry, of voters and citizens who actively participate in debating issues, helping elect representatives who hold Washington accountable. But those with no stake in our political system, no skin in the game, and who believe they have no voice, will leave the field to others, to the professional lobbyists and influence seekers, to those who have billions at stake in the decisions of government. This is not an acceptable outcome for a democracy, and we should be actively seeking solutions for ways to bring more integrity and trust to our institutions of democracy and governance. There should be tighter rules against any employment for a term of years by a bureaucrat or a congressman in the industry they regulated, oversaw, or financed through appropriations. I also believe in term limits. I ran on it as a candidate and as governor. I think it would be a good thing for Congress, because there's this thing called incumbency that reaches up and grabs people, and it grows very deep roots, and pretty soon nobody wants to leave. And we look at the system and say, why is it that crony capitalism prevails? And I think there you have one of the reasons why. So friends, needless to say, I believe we are at a crossroads. But I'm also convinced that the American people will vote for free markets under equal rules of the game, because there is no opportunity or job growth any other way. However, to build a broad-based coalition needed to undertake these structural reforms, we cannot just make our case to fellow travelers. We need to appeal to those who are conservative by temperament, but not necessarily by ideology. Everyone from the so-called Reagan Democrats to young Hispanic families and independent urban voters. Now, I've been fortunate enough to see much of this country, and everywhere I go, I see people doing extraordinary things. Not far from here, writers are penning words that will move billions of people across the world. Outside of San Francisco, where I was yesterday, Google computer scientists are building driverless cars. In Houston, Texas, other engineers have unleashed an energy revolution that is going to transform our competitive possibilities. In Cambridge, Massachusetts, doctors are doing work that will eventually cure Alzheimer's disease. I've never been more bullish about the future of the American economy, and I've never been more pessimistic about our political class. But that is an unforced error, and it's an unforced error that we can begin to solve, because we have no choice. We have to solve it. You know, this journey of ours takes on new and urgent meaning when you recognize that many of our fellow Americans have paid the ultimate price, allowing us to even have this conversation here today. Someone asked me during the campaign, what was the hardest thing that you ever had to do as governor? And they were probably a bit surprised by my response. It wasn't delivering a flat tax or reform initiatives with the legislature. I said, here was my toughest thing as governor. I flew to Afghanistan with a couple of other governors to visit our forward deployed National Guard troops. As governor, you get to be commander-in-chief of the National Guard, and it's a terrific honor beyond my ability to fully articulate it. And I arrived in Kabul, and a representative from the embassy came up and told me that one of our guardsmen had been shot and killed the day before on the Pakistan border. And would I be willing to go to his memorial service to eulogize him? Well, I said, of course, I'd be honored and delighted to do that. I'd never met Second Lieutenant Scott Lundell, but I was thinking a lot about him in that long journey from Kabul to Camp Phoenix, which is a forward deployed base right outside of Kabul, Afghanistan. And I stood in a room about half the size, full of bedraggled, tired public servants we call soldiers, there to eulogize their fallen colleague. And in front of my podium was his rifle and his boots and a few tokens that were near and dear to him, a Bible, letters from his kids. And I mustered everything I could to articulate my sense of loss, their family having given the ultimate sacrifice, and his deep commitment to service as a National Guard trooper. And then I did something that was even harder. I took his personal belongings, flew all the way home to Salt Lake City, Utah, and got in a car and drove out to see his wife. And I knocked at her door, and I'll never forget what I saw and what I heard. She opened that door, and there she stood with 4 young kids, all under 12. And I, mustering up words that didn't come easy, I'm an emotional guy, and that was a tough situation. I said, on behalf of a grateful nation and a grateful state, I just wanted to convey our deep love and appreciation and recognition for your family having given the ultimate sacrifice. And with that, I handed over her husband's personal effects. And she turned to me stoically, without a tear in her eye. And she said, I can go forward. I can live on, because I know that my husband died believing his cause was just. And I thought, we are a unique people. We are truly a unique people. Folks have sacrificed for this moment. We will not let it be wasted, ladies and gentlemen. To choose national decline is to dishonor the memory of those who gave everything to assure we would have the chance to change. This nation knows how to do it because we've been there before and we've changed. This building was built to tell the story of how it was done, and it will be done again, and it must be done for the sake of freedom and the security of our next generation. Thank you all very much. It's an honor and privilege to be with you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, we have about 10 minutes and a lot more questions on these cards than 10 minutes will allow, but so many of you have been nice enough to forward your questions to the governor, and I'll do my best to ask them and see how many we can get through. Okay, Governor?
I'm with you.
All right. Ronald Reagan worked across party lines. Do you believe that President Obama does this as well?
Well, I was appointed by President Obama. I gave him high marks for appointing a Republican to a key national security spot. But I cringe when political messaging is used during a State of the Union and an inauguration speech, when we ought to be pulling people together and talking about unity and problem solving and putting forward the kinds of options on the negotiating table that actually can move the policy ball forward. I believe that the President has a lot to learn from President Reagan when it comes to bringing people in. President Reagan was a big tent president. He was a big tent human being. He had a great love for other people. He might disagree with your politics, but he didn't wear that disagreement on his sleeve. He brought you into the office. He brought you into the tent, so to speak. He also believed in problem solving, in getting something done. We somehow, John, I think, have lost the art of doing a deal, problem solving. We spin, we spin, we spin, we complain, we point fingers, we get on TV and talk about the other side not doing this, that, and the other. And we forget that it wasn't so long ago, under President Reagan, where people would sit around a table, people of good faith and common sense, and they would carve out a direction for the country and they would get it done. They weren't all like-minded ideologically. That's not how the system works. But there wasn't the extreme partisanship that made it almost impossible to even take a seat around the table. And I say the President could be doing a whole lot more in building an atmosphere, an environment that spoke to unity and problem solving and progress, and sadly we're not getting it.
Speaking of President Reagan, what is your favorite personal story from your time with the President?
Boy, there were so many unforgettable moments with the President. I would have to say that probably one of the most memorable, because I've lived in China most recently, and I'd go back and forth to the Great Hall of the People, which is kind of their center of power in Beijing, right next to Tiananmen Square. Many of you have seen that, I'm sure. And I was there. I don't know if Gary was there or Andrew. I know Jim Hooley was there, and I know Rick Ahern was there, because I was saluting them. And we had an event in the Great Hall of the People. And this was President Reagan's first trip to China. He hadn't been there before. And he showed up at the Great Hall of the People, and it was an image I'll never forget, because the most charismatic leader I've ever seen, that of Ronald Reagan, walked in one side of the Great Hall of the People. I was just the advance man in the corner, trying to make sure that, the media were getting their proper coverage. Tan, the California elegance, the regal nature of having been a movie star at one point, and just the aura that he projected. And out of the other side of the room came Deng Xiaoping, 4'11", a firebrand from Sichuan, chain smoker, and those two shook hands in the middle of the Great Hall of the People.
and it was a handshake that I'll never forget. I mean, the room lit up. Two very, very charismatic leaders, different ideological points of view, different populations that they had to manage, and they took their seats in one of those big cavernous rooms. So the president sat down, and Dung sat down. His feet didn't even touch the ground. And he lit up one of those filterless cigarettes that he smoked endlessly. He lived to be 90-plus years old. I don't know how it happened. And he turned to President Reagan and clapped his hands and said, "Let's get down to business. Let's see what we can do to change the world." And they connected. And they connected as leaders, respectful, articulating their points of view, which were different, obviously, but joining forces to try to make the relationship then in its embryonic stages work, which today has become soon to be the largest trading relationship the world has ever known, $500 billion in trade. And I reflect back on the magnetism of Ronald Reagan, the connection that was made at the highest levels of international diplomacy. And I compare and contrast that, we won't mention names, but to other modern day leaders who sit at the table and the talking points come out and it's icy. There's no rapport on a personal basis, no heart-to-heart, mind-to-mind kind of community. And it's talking points on our side, talking points on there. And we wonder why we can't get business done sometimes. President Reagan brought that ability to disarm anybody and the ability to speak in a folksy, genuine, American-based way that really represented the best ideals and values of the American people.
What would be your outline of a grand compromise to reduce the budget deficit?
Well, my biggest complaint with the whole thing that's going on is that we don't show any courage anymore because there's no leadership behind a big, bold, visionary proposal. Like what happened in 1986 under tax reform under President Reagan. Jack Kemp played a very critical role on Capitol Hill. I mean, to think that that could be done again is almost impossible given the state of affairs on Capitol Hill. But we're going to have these debt ceilings and these fiscal cliffs and these 6-month periodic, run for cover, life-threatening situations until we basically recognize that we fundamentally need sweeping tax reform. We need to embrace something along the lines of Simpson-Bowles that puts a target out there on spending over the next 10 years. And it breaks my heart to think that, I'm affiliated with some pretty major corporations in the United States, and nobody can seem to do their planning around capital expenditures these days because they don't know what the next 6 months is going to bring. There's no consistency or clarity in the marketplace, yet the market wants to grow. I mean, the place wants to take off right now, but for Congress, which seems to be highly dysfunctional, the marketplace wants to rev up. So it's almost as if the marketplace has carved a path right around Washington, rendered it completely irrelevant, and it continues moving forward. We might do 2.5% to 3% growth this year, but can you imagine where we would be today if we had the kind of tax package that existed in 1986, the kind just at a state level, because I saw the growth economically after we got it done. It took me 2 years to get it done, but it was a flat tax, and we phased out the loopholes and deductions, which carry a $1.1 trillion ball and chain around our ankle. Year in and year out, we're carrying $1.1 trillion in just, I call it nonsense, but people get upset when I do that, in a lot of loopholes and deductions, including corporate welfare. And I say if we were brave enough and courageous enough to make a grand bargain, there's stuff Republicans would certainly like, and there's a whole lot in there that the Democrats should find attractive. But for leadership out of the White House, sitting down with Congress on Capitol Hill, they ought to be locking themselves in a room, for heaven's sake, and not getting out until they have a deal done. I mean, that's generally how things should be done, right?
How can college students get involved in a campaign?
That's the easiest thing in the world. Find your favorite candidate, show your passion by getting out and getting involved. I meet young people all around this country. I speak on college campuses on a regular basis. If you want to get a sense of renewal in where our country is going, go out to a college campus. Now, I get to a few of different, I have 2 boys at the U.S. Naval Academy, so I get, from that end, I see what our next generation of warriors are going to look like, and I get to other regular liberal arts colleges and universities, and I see what the next generation of doers and leaders are going to, and they're smart, and they're ambitious, and they love their country, and they want to get involved at the grassroots and move on. Whenever I step away from a campus, I'm reinvigorated about where this country is going. But I would tell the young people who are here, I know we've got a lot of young people who are in our audience, start early and follow that passion if it is politics, and if you want to play a role in shaping the affairs of your country going forward, which is a noble undertaking, get involved with a candidate, get in there, roll up your sleeves, get a list of the issues that you believe in. I don't care whether you're a Republican or Democrat or a libertarian or a vegetarian, whatever. Get in there and get involved, because that's what makes our system work. But I will just give you this cautionary note, because I found when I was reelected the year 2008 that we had a large drop-off in young people getting involved in politics because of cynicism. I hope that those of you who are here can share your enthusiasm with others, because I know there are a lot of young people in this country who are downright cynical, and they've given up on the system for a lot of the reasons we've talked about tonight. Too much money, the same people get reelected, their vote doesn't count. I mean, here, you know, my own party, we've written off California. You don't even think about you've written off New York. There are swaths of land in this country that we don't even think we can be competitive in anymore. Ronald Reagan used to campaign in New York City. He used to campaign in Chicago and San Francisco and Los Angeles. That's the way it used to be. So don't let the recent trends in politics lead you to cynicism, because we're going to need your generation to fix it. Whether it's the way we go about redistricting, which is going to be a heavy, to stop to think, John, that 70% of our seats today are perfectly predictable, red and blue, MSNBC, Fox, Republican, Democrat, because of the redistricting that has gone on. They're not even competitive. And so it's the primary that matters more than the general election. 70%. We've got to get back to a little more competition in our congressional races like we do in the economy. That's a good thing. And it's going to take the young generation to take those steps through courage and activity to make it happen.
Great. Well, on that note, Governor, we are about out of time, but I want to, on behalf of everyone here, say thank you so much. We've been so honored to have you here. It was just terrific.
Thank you. It's a great honor and privilege. Thank you. Great being with you. Thank you.